He stood in the pouring rain, clutching a cardboard box of his belongings, while his billionaire CEO sneered at his scuffed shoes, fired for ruining the company's luxury aesthetic. But what she didn't know was that the little flash drive in his pocket was about to cost her $50 billion. Thomas Reynolds was a ghost in his own life. At 34, his shoulders carried the heavy, invisible weight of a man who had not slept a full night in 3 years. He was a senior back-end engineer at Sterling Innovations, a Silicon Valley titan known for sleek, hyper-minimalist consumer tech and an aggressively elite corporate culture. But Thomas didn't look elite. His once sharp face was hollowed by exhaustion. His dress shirts were frayed at the cuffs, and the soles of his generic dress shoes were worn down to the rubber base. To the rest of the world, Thomas might have looked like a man who simply had given up. But the truth was hidden in a small, sterile hospital room on the other side of the city. His 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, had been born with a rare congenital heart defect. 3 open-heart surgeries, endless specialist consultations, and aggressive post-operative care had entirely drained Thomas's savings, his 401k, and the equity in the modest home he had been forced to sell. He now lived with Chloe in a cramped, drafty, 1-bedroom apartment. Every single cent of his $140,000 salary, after taxes, went directly to paying off the mountain of medical debt and keeping up with Chloe's out-of-pocket medication costs. He ate instant ramen, walked 3 miles to the train station to save on gas, and wore the same 3 threadbare suits on rotation. At Sterling Innovations, appearance was everything. The company's founder and CEO, Jacqueline Sterling, was a self-made billionaire whose obsession with aesthetics bordered on pathological. Jacqueline was 42, impeccably dressed in custom Italian tailoring, and ruled her glass and steel empire with an iron fist. She frequently boasted in business magazines that her company didn't just sell luxury tech. Her employees were luxury tech. They were required to be sharp, polished, and flawless. Thomas was none of those things. He survived at the company solely because he was brilliant. His direct manager, a slick, fast-talking opportunist named Greg Donovan, knew this perfectly well. Greg happily took Thomas's flawless code, slapped his own name on the weekly reports, and presented them to the executive board. Greg kept Thomas hidden in the basement-level server hubs, ensuring the eyesore never crossed paths with the image-obsessed CEO, until the morning of the Japanese Investor Summit. Jacqueline had spent 6 months courting a massive Tokyo-based venture capital firm, hoping to secure a $10 billion valuation push ahead of Sterling Innovations' IPO. The entire executive suite was in a frenzy. The glass atrium of the headquarters was polished to a blinding shine. Caterers carried trays of imported caviar, and a string quartet played softly in the lobby. Jacqueline, wearing a staggering $3,000 white blazer, was leading the lead investor, Mr. Takahashi, through the main floor to showcase their new artificial intelligence processing hub. At that exact moment, alarms began blaring in the basement. A catastrophic memory leak in the central server array was threatening to crash the presentation network, right as Jacqueline was meant to demonstrate the AI's capabilities on the atrium's massive screens. Panic erupted. Greg Donovan, sweating profusely, realized he had absolutely no idea how to fix the back-end architecture he had claimed to have built. Desperate, he radioed Thomas. "Get to the atrium server terminal, now. If the network goes down, we are all dead." Thomas, who had been pulling a 36-hour shift to cover a co-worker's weekend for extra overtime pay, didn't hesitate. He sprinted up the service stairs, bursting through the maintenance doors and out onto the pristine, white marble floor of the main atrium. He dropped to his knees in front of the master terminal, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. Within 90 seconds, he isolated the memory leak, rerouted the processing power to auxiliary servers, and stabilized the network. The massive screens flared to life, displaying the Sterling Innovations logo flawlessly, just as Jacqueline and Mr. Takahashi rounded the corner. Thomas let out a heavy breath, wiping a smear of grease from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He stood up, turning around to head back to the basement. He froze. Jacqueline Sterling was standing 10 feet away, staring at him. The silence in the atrium was deafening. Mr. Takahashi and his entourage looked from the billionaire CEO to the disheveled man standing in the center of the pristine room. Thomas's oversized, faded grey trousers were stained at the knees from kneeling. His shoes were scuffed and cracked. His tie was frayed, and dark, bruised bags hung heavily under his bloodshot eyes. In a sea of Armani and Prada, Thomas looked like a vagrant who had wandered in from the street. Jacqueline's jaw tightened. A muscle feathered in her cheek. She offered a tight, artificial smile to the investors, smoothly directing them toward the conference room. But as she passed Greg Donovan, she stopped. "Who is that?" she hissed, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with absolute venom. "That's, Reynolds? Back-end engineering," Greg stammered, terrified. "Get him out of my sight," Jacqueline ordered, her eyes entirely dead. "He looks like he crawled out of a dumpster. He is a stain on my brand. Mr. Sterling, he just saved the network. I don't care if he cured a disease, Greg. We are a luxury technology firm. What do you think Takahashi just thought? That we employ beggars? Fire him. Have security escort him out before the investors finish their espresso." 5 minutes later, Thomas was called into a sterile, glass-walled HR office. Greg sat across the table, refusing to make eye contact. He slid a standard severance agreement across the desk. "I'm sorry, Tom," Greg said, though his voice lacked any real empathy. "It's coming straight from the top. You're terminated, effective immediately." Thomas felt the floor drop out from beneath him. A cold sweat broke out over his neck. "Terminated? Greg, I just saved the entire AI presentation. You know I wrote that back-end architecture. I haven't slept since Tuesday." "It's not about the work, Tom," Greg sighed, tapping his expensive pen against the glass. "It's about culture fit. You don't fit the Sterling brand. You're scaring the investors." "Culture fit," Thomas choked out, his voice cracking. "I make 140 grand a year, and I walk to work because my daughter needs a new heart valve next month. I don't buy suits because she needs anti-rejection meds. You know this, Greg. Keep your voice down," Greg snapped, glancing nervously at the glass door. "Look, I'll sign off on a 2-week severance. But you need to pack your desk. Now." Thomas stood up, his hands shaking with a mixture of profound humiliation and absolute terror. He thought of Chloe, sitting in their cold apartment, drawing pictures of butterflies while a babysitter he could barely afford watched over her. He had no savings. If he lost his health insurance, Chloe's upcoming surgery would be cancelled. In a moment of sheer desperation, Thomas burst out of the HR office and marched straight toward the executive suites. Security guards shouted, but he dodged them, throwing open the heavy oak doors of Jacqueline Sterling's private lounge. Jacqueline was sipping sparkling water, checking her phone. She looked up, her expression hardening into absolute disgust. "Security. Miss Sterling, please!" Thomas begged, standing near the doorway. "I'll stay in the basement. I'll work night shifts. I won't ever come up to the main floors. But please, my little girl has a congenital heart defect. She needs surgery in 3 weeks. If I lose my company insurance, she could die. Please, I'm begging you. I'm a good engineer." Jacqueline set her glass down. She stood up, smoothing the front of her immaculate blazer. She walked slowly toward him, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes raking over his cheap, worn-out clothing with unapologetic revulsion. "Sterling Innovations is a tech empire, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice completely devoid of warmth. "Not a charity. If you can't manage your personal finances well enough to buy a decent pair of shoes, that is a testament to your own incompetence. Clear your desk." The rain was torrential as Thomas walked the 3 miles back to his apartment, a small cardboard box pressed against his chest to shield his few belongings. He didn't feel the freezing water soaking through his thin jacket. He was completely numb. When he finally unlocked the door to his apartment, the babysitter, a kind older neighbor named Mrs. Gable, took one look at his face and knew better than to ask for her hourly rate that day. She simply squeezed his arm and slipped out. Thomas walked into the living room. Chloe was asleep on the faded sofa, a blanket pulled up to her chin. Her breathing was slightly labored, a constant reminder of the faulty valve in her small heart. Thomas sank to the floor beside her, burying his face in his wet hands, and finally broke down. He wept silently, terrified of the abyss that had just opened beneath them. But as the hours passed and the rain stopped, the despair began to harden. A strange, metallic coldness settled in Thomas's chest. Jacqueline Sterling hadn't just fired him. She had looked at his suffering, at his child's fight for life, and swatted him away like a diseased insect because his poverty offended her billionaire sensibilities. Thomas stood up. He walked over to his tiny kitchen table, which served as his home office. Sitting on it was an old, battered laptop he had bought from a pawn shop 3 years ago. While Greg Donovan thought Thomas spent his nights strictly maintaining the company's servers, Thomas had actually been building something else, something for himself. To keep his coding skills sharp and distract his mind from his daughter's medical bills, Thomas had spent the last 2 years developing a proprietary data compression algorithm. He called it Project Ether. In the tech world, data storage and transfer speeds were the ultimate bottleneck. Cloud companies spent billions building massive server farms to hold user data. Project Ether was a revolutionary algorithmic sequence that could compress raw data by an astonishing 70% without losing a single pixel of fidelity, and decompress it instantaneously. It was the holy grail of cloud computing. If deployed, it would cut global server costs by more than half. 4 months ago, out of a misguided sense of loyalty, Thomas had taken Project Ether to Greg Donovan. He had compiled a presentation and brought it to Greg's office, hoping to secure a promotion or a bonus to help pay for Chloe's bills. Greg had barely looked at the screen. He had laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. Data compression. "Tom, we're building artificial intelligence. We don't care about making files smaller. Stop wasting company time on this garbage." Thomas had insisted, begging Greg to look at the math. Annoyed, Greg had sent Thomas a scathing email to establish a paper trail, formally rejecting the project. Thomas pulled up his personal email archive now and stared at the screen. From G. Donovan, Sterling Innovations Management. To T. Reynolds. Subject: RA Project Ether Proposal. Tom, let me be crystal clear. Sterling Innovations has absolutely zero interest in Project Ether. We do not want it, we will not fund it, and we formally reject any association with this side project. Do not bring it up again, or I will write you up for wasting company resources. Focus on your assigned back-end tasks. Thomas read the email 3 times. A slow, dangerous smile crept onto his face for the first time in months. In standard tech employment contracts, any intellectual property created by an employee belongs to the company. But there is a massive legal loophole. If an employee formally presents an invention to the company, and the company explicitly and formally rejects it in writing, claiming no interest or association, the rights revert entirely to the creator. Greg Donovan, in his arrogance and eagerness to put Thomas down, had legally forfeited Sterling Innovations' claim to $1 trillion technology, and Thomas had built the entire thing on a pawn shop laptop, entirely off the company network. It was his. 100%. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He spent 8 hours refining the code, securing the patents through an online legal portal, using the absolute last of his credit card limits, and compiling a flawless demonstration package. The next morning, Thomas put on his best suit. He spent an hour ironing it, polishing his cracked shoes with black wax until they shined, and trimming his hair. He looked in the mirror. He still looked poor, but he no longer looked broken. He looked dangerous. He kissed Chloe on the forehead, asked Mrs. Gable to watch her for one more day, and took the train to the wealthiest district in Silicon Valley. But he wasn't going to Sterling Innovations. He walked into the towering, obsidian-black skyscraper of Zenith Dynamics. Zenith was Sterling Innovations' fiercest rival, while Jacqueline Sterling focused on luxury consumer tech and sleek AI interfaces. Zenith was the undisputed king of cloud architecture and enterprise servers. The CEO, Richard Caldwell, was a notorious bulldog in the industry, a ruthless but pragmatic man who cared nothing for aesthetics and everything for raw, undeniable results. Thomas didn't have an appointment. He walked up to the intimidating front desk, pulled out the small, encrypted flash drive containing Project Ether, and placed it on the marble counter. "My name is Thomas Reynolds," he told the receptionist. "I am the former lead back-end architect for Sterling Innovations. Tell Richard Caldwell I have the algorithm that is going to make Jacqueline Sterling file for bankruptcy." The receptionist at Zenith Dynamics let out a polite, dismissive laugh, clearly ready to call security. But something in Thomas's dead, unblinking stare made her hesitate. He didn't look crazy. He looked like a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. She picked up her phone, dialed a secure extension, and whispered a few words. 10 minutes later, Thomas was escorted onto the top floor. Richard Caldwell's office was a stark contrast to the blinding white elegance of Sterling Innovations. It was dark wood, messy whiteboards covered in complex equations, and empty coffee mugs. Caldwell himself was a large, broad-shouldered man in his 50s. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie was loosened, and he looked intensely annoyed. "I have exactly 4 minutes before a board meeting, Mr. Reynolds," Caldwell growled, not looking up from his tablet. "My head of security said you claim to have something that can bankrupt Jacqueline Sterling. Considering she's about to IPO at a $10 billion valuation, I highly doubt that. But I hate that pretentious woman enough to give you 3 minutes to prove it. Talk." Thomas didn't say a word. He walked to the massive interactive display board on Caldwell's wall, plugged in his encrypted flash drive, and pulled up a command terminal. "I know Zenith Dynamics is bleeding cash on server farm real estate," Thomas said, his voice steady. "Your enterprise clients are generating too much data, and you physically cannot build data centers fast enough to store it. You're looking at a $2 billion deficit next quarter, just in hardware expansion." Caldwell finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "That is classified internal forecasting. How do you know that?" "Because it's a universal bottleneck," Thomas replied. He typed a rapid sequence of commands. "I have spent the last 2 years building a proprietary algorithmic sequence. I call it Project Ether. It compresses raw, complex data streams by 74% with 0 fidelity loss, and decompresses in real time." Caldwell let out a harsh, barking laugh. 74%? Impossible? The industry cap is barely 30. You're lying. Watch, Thomas said. He initiated the protocol, targeting a massive, publicly available open-source database, over 500 terabytes of raw video and architectural renders. Caldwell watched the screen. The progress bar didn't crawl, it sprinted. The massive file shrank, folding in on itself through Thomas's complex mathematical architecture. In less than 60 seconds, the file size read 130 terabytes. Thomas then clicked Extract. The files snapped back to their original size, rendering on the screen in flawless, pixel-perfect high definition. The silence in the office was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Caldwell slowly stood up, his coffee mug forgotten on the desk. He walked over to the screen, his face inches from the data readout. He ran the diagnostic tool. No corruption, no data loss. He turned to Thomas, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and predatory hunger. "My God," Caldwell whispered. This renders physical server expansion practically obsolete. We could double our client intake tomorrow without buying a single new hard drive." He looked at Thomas. "Who else knows about this? Does Sterling have the IP?" Thomas smiled, a cold, hard expression. "Sterling explicitly rejected it in writing. It is mine, completely." Caldwell walked back to his desk, his mind moving at light speed. "I will give you $20 million right now for the exclusive patent rights. Cash." It was more money than Thomas could comprehend. It was safety. It was a new life. But the memory of Jacqueline Sterling's sneer, the memory of her looking at his worn-out shoes while he begged for his daughter's life, burned like a furnace in his chest. "No," Thomas said firmly. Caldwell frowned. $50 million. Don't be greedy, son." "I don't want a buyout," Thomas countered, stepping forward, his posture commanding the room. "I want a 10% equity stake in Zenith Dynamics. I want the title of Chief Technology Officer. And most importantly, I want your private corporate medical team sent to my apartment within the hour to transport my daughter to the best pediatric cardiology unit in the state, fully covered." Caldwell stared at the disheveled man in the cheap suit. He saw the fire in Thomas's eyes. Caldwell grinned, extending a massive hand. "Deal, Mr. Reynolds. Let's go ruin a billionaire." The next 3 weeks were a blur. True to his word, Caldwell deployed Zenith's elite medical fixers. Chloe was transported via private ambulance to a premier private hospital. Under the care of world-renowned surgeons, her heart valve replacement was a complete success. When Thomas sat by her bedside, watching the color return to her pale cheeks and her monitor display a strong, steady heartbeat, the crushing weight he had carried for years finally vanished. With his daughter safe, Thomas threw himself into the war room at Zenith Dynamics. Caldwell gave him limitless resources, a massive corner office, and a team of 50 elite engineers to scale Project Ether for a global launch. Thomas was transformed. Dressed in sharp, tailored suits, his hollow eyes now sharp and focused, he was no longer the ghost in the basement. He was the apex predator of Silicon Valley, and they were hunting Jacqueline Sterling. The morning of Sterling Innovations' IPO was a media spectacle. Jacqueline Sterling had spared no expense. The trading floor on Wall Street was adorned with her company's sleek, minimalist banners. She stood on the balcony overlooking the floor, dressed in a custom $5,000 crimson suit, a glass of vintage champagne in her hand. Mr. Takahashi and his team of investors stood beside her, beaming. Sterling Innovations was offering its shares at $100 to $20 apiece, projecting a massive opening surge based entirely on their new, hyper-advanced AI platform, a platform that, behind the scenes, required incredibly expensive, massive server farms to run. At 9:15 a.m., 15 minutes before the opening bell, Jacqueline's phone buzzed. It was Greg Donovan. "Miss Sterling," Greg stammered, panic lacing his voice. "Turn on CNBC, right now." Frowning, Jacqueline gestured to a floor manager to switch the massive digital monitors from the IPO countdown to the news network. The screen flickered, revealing a live press conference from the headquarters of Zenith Dynamics. Richard Caldwell stood at a podium, looking uncharacteristically polished. "For years, the tech industry has been chained to the physical limitations of data storage," Caldwell announced to the flashing cameras. "Today, Zenith Dynamics shatters those chains. We are proud to unveil Project Ether, a proprietary compression algorithm that reduces server load by over 70%. Jacqueline's breath hitched. She knew instantly what this meant. If Zenith had this technology, the cost of cloud computing was about to plummet. Her company's massive AI infrastructure, which relied heavily on expensive traditional data processing, would instantly become a bloated, financially unviable dinosaur. "But I cannot take credit for this paradigm shift," Caldwell continued, stepping aside. "I want to introduce the creator of Project Ether, our new Chief Technology Officer, and my partner, Mr. Thomas Reynolds." Jacqueline dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the floor. Walking up to the podium, looking immaculate in a tailored midnight blue suit, was the man she had fired for looking like a beggar. Thomas approached the microphone. He looked directly into the camera, and Jacqueline felt a chill run down her spine, as if he were staring straight into her soul. "Sterling Innovations claims to represent the future of artificial intelligence," Thomas said smoothly. "But their infrastructure is obsolete. As of this morning, Zenith Dynamics is offering the Ether protocol to all enterprise clients at a fraction of standard hosting costs. The era of massive, expensive server farms is over." Chaos erupted on the trading floor. The monitors tracking pre-market indicators for Sterling Innovations flashed neon red. The projected share price began to freefall. $120, $90, $60. "What is happening?" Jacqueline shrieked, grabbing a broker by the collar. "Zenith just made your entire back-end architecture financially worthless," the broker yelled over the din. "Institutional investors are pulling their orders. It's a bloodbath." Mr. Takahashi stared at the screen, his face hardening. He turned to Jacqueline, offered a curt, formal bow, and walked away with his entourage. The $10 billion anchor investment vanished in an instant. By 9:30 a.m., the bell rang, but it sounded like a death knell. Sterling Innovations opened at a pathetic $14 a share and continued to plummet. In less than an hour, Jacqueline Sterling lost nearly $6 billion in net worth. Blind with rage, Jacqueline stormed back to her headquarters, screaming for her legal team. She burst into her boardroom, where her top corporate attorneys were already frantically reviewing documents. "Sue him!" Jacqueline screamed, her immaculate hair now frantic and disheveled. "He worked for us. He built that algorithm while on my payroll. It's our intellectual property. I want an injunction by noon." "Ms. Sterling," the lead attorney said, his face pale. "We can't." "What do you mean we can't? It's standard corporate contract law." The attorney slid a printed piece of paper across the polished mahogany table. "We just received a preemptive legal filing from Zenith's lawyers. Included in the discovery is a time-stamped email from your head of engineering, Greg Donovan." Jacqueline snatched the paper. Her eyes darted across the text. "Tom, let me be crystal clear. Sterling Innovations has absolutely zero interest in Project Ether. We do not want it, we will not fund it, and we formally reject any association with this side project." Jacqueline felt the room spinning. Greg's arrogant, dismissive email constituted a formal, legally binding rejection of intellectual property rights. They had willingly handed over $1 trillion technology because her manager wanted to put an employee in his place. "Where is Greg?" Jacqueline whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute defeat and homicidal fury. "He's clearing out his desk, Ma'am. He resigned 10 minutes ago." Across the city, Thomas Reynolds stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his new corner office, looking out over the skyline. His phone vibrated with alerts detailing the historic collapse of Sterling Innovations stock, but he barely glanced at it. His assistant knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Reynolds, your driver is ready downstairs." Thomas smiled warmly. "Thank you. I need to get to the hospital. My daughter is being discharged today." He walked out of the office, his head held high. He didn't care about the billions of dollars Zenith was about to make, or the glass empire he had just shattered. He had won the only battle that ever truly mattered. He was going home to his little girl. If you loved this story of a father's ultimate comeback, don't let the inspiration stop here. We bring you the most dramatic, satisfying stories of underdogs turning the tables on arrogance every single week. Hit that like button if you think the CEO got what she deserved, share this with someone who needs a little motivation, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life drama.